So then we are back with more understandings from the time of the Second Tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Tzaielic lineage. So then we can understand the time of the end as per Yeshayahu the prophet. We find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste from many centuries. Today is the Holy Shabbat, and then many of the Messiah's people in many parts of this world are gathering in the synagogues, and they are gathering for the reading of the holy instructions. These words are eternal. They were from the Holy Creator, Yahweh, and He gave us very specific understandings as far as the time of the spring feast, where then the Holy Savior Himself, Yahweh Yeshua, came, and He very wisely gave us very important aspects of the times and the seasons. Sometimes the Creator, He works in such a way against sometimes our own desires, but truly it is for our best. Let's then understand a factor related with Yeshayahu, the 61st chapter, where then the Messiah himself, he was reading the holy instructions, and he came where then Yeshayahu pointed out as then the spring feast. As the Messiah was then involved with the completion of the spring feast, he said then that these words then were at that point completed. And the people, they simply were observing him very intently, because he was obviously giving a very completion of a strong portion of the scripture. And then he sat down and he handed over the holy instructions, and obviously they were observing him of something else coming out of his mouth. And they realized when there was the silence, then the presence of the Messiah was very strong. So let's then understand the second portion where the Messiah did not read, related with the vengeance, or then the autumn feast, where then Yahweh Yeshua then is the very place where then the Creator himself execute his portion of these scripture, obviously against his own desire, his own person, because he's never for destruction, but this world must come to an end because sin is contaminated this entire planet. But let's then shift then this understanding of the Messiah himself and then back to the prophets, so we can establish a very strong position as far as our time, this time in season, the time of the restoration. Let's then understand a factor. The Messiah himself, he was a person, but he was obligated of obeying every portion of what the prophets said regarding himself. So the Messiah was bound to do precisely what the instructions stated via the prophets. So must we. But we have the pathway set by the Messiah himself, where then we can understand what he did, and he explained the holy instructions for us. Obviously, during the time of his spring feast completion, then he was involved with certain aspects of the holy instructions related with obedience, 100% pure obedience. During his time of service, the Messiah himself was 490 days doing his work, and he was obedient 100%. Whatsoever was required from the holy instructions, he was 100% compliant. The Messiah then did not speak of the future during his time of service, but he was concerned with the people being obedient of what Moses said to do and observe. When he was then put on stake, and he died on the stake, Then he went to the Sheol for 72 hours. He stayed down there, and then he came back. Then he stayed with his people for an entire year. And then he explained step by step what those holy instructions were, the holy feasts and the times and the seasons. He explained his 1,000 years of reign, and then the destruction of the holy cities. He explained in the time of deceit. He explained then when the holy miltha was going to be then stolen from the holy cities, that it was absolutely meant only for those people who are obedient. And then for 1,000 years the world is scoundrelized. And then in 2009, after the completion of the 1,000 years of Nahashatan, and he stole the holy miltha, but it's coming back to the hands of the Messiah. And then we are during the time of the restoration period, where then Yeshayahu the prophet mentioned very precisely, Yeshayahu chapter 1:8 explains then the rivers, beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, you find then the place where the violent ones are at. And prior of these, then the land of Cush. If you read it, you understand. Then the times and the seasons and the holy Shabbats and the lunar views of every month must be restored. Why then the land of Cush? Because during the time of the ascension of the Messiah, then there was a huge persecution on the land. Noted, when the Messiah was spending his time with his people for a year, when he came back from the dead, prosperity was in every corner of the Holy Land. They were absolutely prosperous. In any fashion, way, or form you can think of, the land was very prosperous. Then, after a while, people were then entangled in riches rather than the holy instructions. But the Messiah did this for a purpose. He wanted an absolute understanding of whom would become obedient and those who did not. And at the end, prior of his ascension, then he began explaining what he saw down there in Sheol, plus the consequences of the people wanting riches of this world without tabernacling. And as he was explaining, people truly felt that Sheol or Inferno was awaiting them. They had many riches. They have the riches of the entire world, you might say. But when the Messiah spoke, they saw the disparity of riches versus saving the soul. In order for the saving of the soul, must understand tabernacling, and a person must become galad, or revealed. Understandably, the Messiah then explained revelation, or then the second portion of the holy instructions, the autumn feast. Revelation is the explanation of the autumn feast, the second portion of the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu the prophet. And people were angry because they thought, in the final moment of the history of the Hebrew people, mostly, they thought they had what they wanted. And the Messiah said, no, this truly is not yet. Yeah, but everything was going so fine. Trade was doing fine. People were trusting each other. But the Messiah said, that's not the point yet. Must understand tabernacling and inform the rest of the world of vengeance coming. The second portion of the 61st chapter of Yeshayahu, known as vengeance, or then Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, from the 23rd verse through the 44th. And they were angry because they thought they had done whatsoever they could to get to that point. But then there was the second portion of the obedience. His people then obeyed the holy instructions, and they practiced it for 1,000 years. And then the Messiah said, then you people have to go out again, form holy cities as per the instructions of Moses, and then believe what the Messiah said with the help from Ruach HaKodesh, and then save the other people. So they were in service 24/7. And some of them honestly got tired of it. Yet the Messiah said, what is for you then if you can gain the entire world, and then at the end, when you breathe your last, your soul goes down to Sheol? And the problem is, if people would say, oh, you don't know where Sheol is like, oh yes, he was down there, he saw it. So from every angle of trying to talk back to the Messiah, he had an answer for it with experience. And they were angry, because whatsoever they had built during this year, as far as riches are concerned, then they felt they had water in their hands and had gone through their fingers, and they had nothing to show forth for. When he ascended, then became a huge persecution on the land. Whatsoever they could find, scraps of information, Megillas, they destroyed them, and they had to drive away those people who were very obedient with the Messiah regarding tabernacling. But those who wanted the riches in this world, in this age, they were very angry. So then, Yohanan was the last of the Shaliach. He went as far as Africa. That's how far he had to go because of the persecution on the land. It was the only place he could find. Then he was very far away from the Holy Land. Then he established the first holy city on the land of Cush, as per the instructions of the prophet Yeshayahu. And then the people saw tabernacling at work. From there, his team put together the documents of Hebrews, and then the instructions of Galah, or Revelation, or the second portion of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter, related with the end of times, and why they should become obedient and then serve for 1,000 years in the holy cities, and then would come a time of desolation, time of destruction of the holy cities for 1,000 years, and then a restoration period for a time, and then the end would come. So then, in order for us to do our part in what the Holy Creator has set before us, let's then read a section of Daniel and understand why the world is going through so many changes, so many transformations, and why are we doing the time of the transition or the restoration period. For 1,000 years it was a time of deceit, when there are no holy cities of the Messiah per the instructions of Moses, and the help from Ruach HaKodesh, and the 7 spirits of Elohim, for the helping of the testifiers on behalf of the Messiah. We, Gentiles, we are testifiers. The Holy Hebrews are the functioners. They are secluded in their places, they form holy cities, and they perform in one of those 7 functions. They don't do any teaching anymore. But the testifiers, the Gentiles, explaining, they do on behalf of the Messiah, they explain. But the Gentiles, they have no functions. So then, as we understand lately, they have found some very important information. So then, some people say, where are we at with the holy instructions? Where can we localize ourselves? Very simply, we are then in Daniel, the 11th chapter, and then verse 8. That's precisely where we are at. How can we get to this place? Very simply. During the time of the restoration period, we have found then Daniel fasting and praying for a long time. More than 20 days he was then fasting. He was not eating what was pleasant, but he set his pray and find out why then the base of the statue had a mixture of iron and clay. He knew the head of gold, he knew the breast and arms of silver, he knew then the center of the body of the statue of bronze, he knew then the legs of iron. But then the base of the statue was incognita. He didn't understand what it was. So he set himself to pray, and he found the answer. The kingdom of the East would direct trade. Why was then related with the trade? Because Daniel was a tradesperson of his time. Then he did understand, related with arms, was the kingdom of the North. And then tabernacling was then going to be established in the kingdom of the South. He knew back then. So what were he at as far as the 8th chapter? Explains of Egypt, a very extremely important country. A country where you find then its existence even when Abraham was involved with his duties. He found Egypt during his time. Egypt is known even before the holy instructions were then recorded as far as the first relationship of the Creator Yahweh and the first person of this planet, Abraham. So then, let's understand a section of the 8th verse. Explains then the functions of Egypt set aside for a time. And then the kingdom of the North coming and giving them what is required for them to become prominent on the land once again. This simply means the Soviet Union must provide arms for Egypt so they can do what they must and then regain control over the land. This is truly as far as we can understand from the holy instructions. It does not give us any kind of understanding of the kingdom of the North influencing or saying what to do as far as leadership military-wise, but explains very precisely to do this action, providing them with arms. And then we are expecting then a relationship with the kingdom of the North and kingdom of the South, where then tabernacling comes from, kingdom of the South, or the land of Cush. But what's going on then with the Soviet Union, for instance? We read in the 7th verse, then the gentile netzer. Netzer simply means a word from the Hebrew language explaining of the olive plant. When the plant grows and becomes big and produces fruit, then if a person cuts down this plant, and then the ramifications of this plant remains on the ground, sometimes for 1,000 years, the plant simply is dead, and then comes a sprout out of the root system. And then, when we understand these via what the Messiah said of himself, explaining that he was coming from the lineage of David, then this same word is used for gentile purposes, but it has another meaning, as explaining of a system. Thus then the Soviet Union is returning, and they must become greater than what they were back then. So then, came out some very much important information regarding the Soviet Union and the gentile netzer being restored. Firstly then, the leadership of the Soviet Union, they are going to have the entire military overhauled and much of the equipment updated, upgraded, and they must become a very strong force, military speaking. So then, there is a talk of the upgrade of the nuclear and conventional arms. There is then the joint with the Iranians, extremely important, because the Iranians, they have the understanding very proper. They understand the United States is the big Satan and Israel is the tiny Satan. The unbelieving Israel is the tiny Satan. United States is the big Satan. And Iran is right. Gog and Magog. That's what we are dealing with. But then let's understand a factor. When the first holy city is established on the land of Cush of our time, the restoration period, then many of the Hebrews on the land of Cush, they are going to make a route up towards the north, towards the Holy Land, and they are going to start pruning, reteaching the people of Israel, so a lot of them are going to be saved. The objective is for every person to get saved. But truly we do know that most of them won't. Yet they are going to make this route. And then, because of this, what else can we find? There are some news regarding then of the basic strategic nuclear forces to go through a top until base overhaul, and the rift amongst then the Moscow and the West over the conflict in Ukraine grows. Then there is the deputy minister said they are overhauling the entire military. And please leave space for production of arms. The Soviet Union must produce arms for the world. So then, because of these, as the first, it's found in Moscow Times, extremely important also newspaper. You have the convenience of having in your own computer. And then also as far as the Leviathans of the sea, explaining of the submarine warfare. You find in the brand new Soviet submarine design then to have nuclear rockets was then conducting a test of the long-delayed Bulava Intercontinental BMC. It is very important for us to understand then the Leviathans and what the Creator made a reference in His own creation terms of these enormous machines of the oceans. They're going to be responsible for the protection of cargo ships, so the world then can be reformed for a time, explaining basic reconstructions of buildings and minimum for the purposes of trade. Cargo ships must be protected by submarines. As we understand this factor also, and there are more news regarding then the situation with the Soviet Union or the Northern Kingdom, they must become 100% overhauled by 2020. Not only this, but the production of arms must be simultaneously, and then the world can start buying their products. Brazil, for instance, a while back, in terms of 6 months ago, a year, Brazil purchased 12 times digits of these weapons of the Soviet Union. Billion USD's worth of Soviet equipment. As we understand, also very extremely important news regarding then Cuba. The island of Cuba is then being used once again as a listening post on behalf of the Soviets. The radio station that was there during the time of the 60s is then back in service, and there were many upgrades that were done, and the Soviets are back in their rightful places. As we understand this factor as then the gentile netzer being then established, We only lack the understanding of Congo, but it is coming. The point of having the Soviet Union and Cuba is already established firmly. Thus 11:7, or Daniel 11th chapter and the 7th verse, then established. Only lacks Congo. Congo then is what the prophet Yeshayahu mentioned as the violent ones beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. Woe to the land beyond the rivers of Ethiopia. This place is then Congo, and must be united with the Soviets and the Chinese and the Cubans. So then the socialist group is then the very factor of stabilizing the trade and the economy of the world. US and the West, they scoundrelized the system. They take away any kind of constancy of the system. They upset the system. China and his friends, they stabilize the system. So people have a time of organizing themselves, set up computers, so then they are ready to do trade with China and China's friends. Thus the importance of the gentile netzer become completely active, so then the world for a time can do trade and understand what's coming in the future. So great news. We have found then the Soviet Union is obviously returning very strongly, must become greater than the former. The world must purchase arms from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union must also provide arms for the Egyptians. And then Cuba is already joined with the Soviet Union. The radio station in Cuba is already activated, going through some repairs. And then lacks Congo, but it's coming very shortly. As we are then in Daniel 11:8, we are expecting then for the other verses to come through. As we do, let's wait and then for the more news coming up in the system regarding Egypt and the stabilization of Egypt in its own rightful place. So please stay tuned. Much more coming up.